Good morning. Access to unemployment and the quality of the working conditions are key factors that impact equal access to economic resources and support reductions in gender inequality. There is a clear evidence of horizontal segregation in the labor market and the existing influence of gender stereotypes on women's occupational and sectoral choices in both the European Union and the Western Balkans. The impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have been felt in the Western Balkans as much as in the rest of the world. Before the pandemic, a catching up process for women was underway. But as more women left the workforce to take on caring responsibilities, this improvement was stalled. Today, the Regional Cooperation Council is presenting the study Economic Benefits of Gender Equality in the Western Balkans, together with Cambridge Econometrics. During this webinar, we will share the findings of the study, trends, and analysis on gender inequality in the Western Balkans, and bring this matter further in a very diverse panel. My name is Bojana Zoric, and I will be accompanied in moderation today by Mrs. Nicola Duel, co-author of this study. Welcome everyone to this online webinar. Without further ado, I would like to move on to the introductory remarks, which will set the tone for our today's webinar. Allow me to first announce the RCC Deputy Secretary General, Mrs. Tanja Miščević. Mrs. Miščević, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bojana. Greetings to all of you, and I hope that we have big interest for today's webinar, as the topic that we are dealing with is extremely important. On behalf of RCC, I'm sorry, I am pleased to welcome you to another event that we are organizing on women economic empowerment, which is in light of our continuous effort to advance gender equality and women empowerment in the region. As you can imagine, we are very proud to be part of these efforts, which need to be further augmented as governments all over the world struggle with recovery plans to contain the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start with sharing some of the data, which always has to be on our mind whenever we are discussing of empowering women, especially in the region that we are coming from. So in Western Balkan 6, gender unemployment gap is 4 times of EU average. Per se, this is a spooky data that really shape the all activities that we are doing. On average, over the period 2010 to 2019, 77% of men aged 20 to 64 in the labor force were employed or were looking for a job, and compared to 52% of women. There has been little change in the Western Balkan 6 average gender participation gap over time. The share of women working as unpaid family workers in the Western Balkan region is 6 times higher than in the EU, and women in Western Balkan 6 are more likely than men to work part-time. In the EU, to compare with, 29% of women employed part-time cite care duties as their main reason for working part-time. In anticipation of International Women's Day this March 8, the European Institute for Gender Equality released some new findings on the impact that coronavirus has had on gender equality in Europe, adding further to job losses, reduced working hours, increased violence, thus reconfirming that COVID-19 pandemic has hit women the hardest. Behind this data, and that is very important to emphasize, there are some qualitative factors that discourage women from accessing the labor markets. This is exactly what this study, commissioned by us, by RCC, does. It looks into relevant factors for gender equality and women empowerment, which are work, time in care activities, knowledge, power, money, and access to services. For example, knowledge. It can be a driver of women empowerment. In tertiary education, 56% of enrolled students in the Western Balkan 6 were female over the period 2015 to 2018. This proportion often remain high, especially in STEM subjects, but high education levels in women do not necessarily translate into higher or equal shares in management positions, an area that remains below the EU average. This does not only raise the issue of gender inequality and discrimination, but also points to the inefficient use of human resources, which is the question that we have to take care of, which is why we need to act together to implement gender equality measures and to change the social context women of the region live in. Unfortunately, COVID-19 pandemic is not the only risk to gender equality. We must take into account that the number of occupations which most of their job profiles at risk of automation is expected to increase over the period 2018 to 30, putting at risk even those small empowerments of and improvements in gender equality in the labor market. In the Western Balkan 6, women have a high share of employment in occupations with high automatic potentials. This process toward gender equality in work could be impeded if gender equality measures do not consider such labor market trends. It is important to understand also that the extent of equality, recent trends, main reason leading to gender gaps at the labor markets and main challenges to tackle them. Removing gender inequalities in the labor market boosts economic growth in the medium term, and the economic effects persist into the long term. In 15 years period, that means period 2015-2030, the EU GDP per capita is expected to improve by up to 1.5% as a result of reducing the gender participation gap. The study that we are presenting today, and we love to call it our RCC study, clearly shows that the Western Balkan 6 economies could raise their GDP per capita by the same percentage, 1.5, by 2035, if they undertake rapid actions to reduce the gender gap in participation rates. This being closely in line with the EU GDP per capita improvement as a result of intervention measures. Last but not least, why empowerment women is key to development. Because behind the economic benefits lies also the social impacts of female employment. Because researchers has indicated when women have access to the labor markets, education and health improve. Because the removal of gender inequality will surely boost economic growth and generate lasting socioeconomic benefits into the future. Therefore, this study comes as the integral part of our women economic empowerment agenda. RCC, let me remind you, has brought the issue of the women economic empowerment at the forefront of the common regional market agenda to assist women in entrepreneurship and establish women entrepreneurship network. Together with the UNDP in December 2020, we launched the initiative of Women Economic Empowerment, which shall allow to strategize on how to best contribute to unlocking woman power in the region, aiming to advance the gender equality as a cornerstone of sustainable development. I am pleased to say that RCC and the UNDP continue their joint action for women empowerment, as demonstrated by their present and active engagement in these two-day event. Study presentation and the establishing of Women in STEM network, which will happen tomorrow. The study puts forward important findings and policy recommendations that shall shape our next action and the regional dialogue for women development. The long-term opportunity and challenge for the Western Balkan 6 economy lies exactly in improving the economic empowerment of women. This involves increasing women's labor market participation, but also reducing female unemployment, closing the gender employment gap, and increasing access to better jobs of the region, as well as international financial institutions, in order to undertake gender-responsive rapid actions. These actions need to be comprehensive and lying into the variety of fields, not only education and employment, but also internship, local economic development strategies, etc. We will continue to raise awareness on the importance of gender equality for empowering women, but also on the need to develop a gender-responsive policy making and for empowering instruments at the disposal of women. Effects, and that we are all aware of, may not become visible in the short term, but they can be long-lasting for the future generation. So I hope that you are going to enjoy, but also learn a lot and use the results of this study from the webinar, and I wish you very fruitful work today and tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Bojana.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Miščević, for those really important points on the gender equality in the Western Balkans. And now I would immediately invite Mrs. Narin Sahakian, UNDP resident representative in North Macedonia, to address the audience. Ms. Sahakian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bojana. Dear Ms. Miščević, dear partners, friends, dear participants of the event, it is a real pleasure for me to be here today and to greet all of you on behalf of United Nations Development Programme. As Ms. Miščević already mentioned, in December last year, UNDP and RCC have forged a strategic partnership for joint action on women economic empowerment. Our partnership has a vision for long-term change, delineating actions to unlock the power of women, whose participation and leadership in the economies of the region are crucial for the inclusive socio-economic development. This mutually reinforcing partnership sets forth priority actions to promote policies that will turn the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity that improves the well-being of all, with a clear understanding that women's economic empowerment is more than ever a top priority. Our failure to adopt the gender perspective in COVID-19 responses will affect the resilience of the societies and the sustainable and just recovery of economies. 1 year since the onset of the COVID pandemic, and we see that the crisis is deepening gender inequalities, urging us to ensure that gender equality is at the core of resilient recovery. Among other actions, United Nations agencies have undertaken socioeconomic impact assessments as a diagnostic for immediate policy responses and longer-term recovery efforts. And in most cases, UNDP was a lead agency for these activities. Our assessments across the globe and in the region, they reveal that the pandemic has had a profound and disproportionate impact on women and girls. They are exposed to greater vulnerability of employment and entrepreneurship across sectors. They lack adequate social protection coverage and have faced increased level of violence at home and sharp increase in unpaid care work and domestic work. Let me use some of the findings from the assessment to demonstrate what I was saying. For example, in Serbia, in the second quarter of 2020, last year, almost 35,000 of women lost their jobs, comparing to the net increase of 1,500 jobs for men. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, women-led businesses had much higher drops in turnover in the February-March last year compared to the businesses led by men. At the same time, women's burden of unpaid care and domestic work increased substantially. In Montenegro, unpaid care and domestic work by women exceed that done by men almost 92% in the second quarter of 2020. If projected to the year, the contribution in unpaid work is the monetary equivalent of the staggering 10% of the national GDP. The really big number. In North Macedonia, we found that women are paying the highest price of the pandemic-induced recession. More than 25,000 women have lost their jobs for the first time. The total number of unemployed unemployed women surpassed the total number of unemployed men. Women workers are majority in the hardest hit sectors, and here I'm referring to textile, tourism, and hospitality sectors. Our assessment found that every 6 women or 15 women out of 100 work in informal economy, making them even more vulnerable to the economic insecurity and downturns. The richness of the data collected through this assessment enable evidence-based policy making. But this can be successful only if the economic empowerment of women will be placed in its core. UNDP is committed to generate and facilitate exchange of knowledge in times of crisis. In partnership with UN Women, we developed the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker, which monitors the gender responsiveness of the measures taken by the governments to tackle the pandemic. The tracker presents more than 2,500 measures in more than 200 countries that directly address women economic and social security, along with the measures to address gender-based violence. If we look into the data for Western Balkan 6, we will see that the 45% of all measures adopted by the governments in response to COVID-19 can be considered as a gender sensitive. However, if we will go a little bit farther and look on figures, we will see that most of them seek to tackle gender-based violence, and only very few measures are addressing women economic insecurity or unpaid care. In closing, I would like to emphasize our commitment to bringing in transformative approaches to women economic empowerment. And we think to implement that through greater investment in gender responsive infrastructure, through a new generation of policies that supports equal redistribution of unpaid care and domestic work, through equal access to assets, finance, and land, and through work with national governments to develop gender-responsive economic plans and social protection programs. At UNDP, we look forward to continue and expand our cooperation with RCC and with the European Union in the Western Balkan region, mobilizing policymakers and stakeholders to enhance dialogue and promote cooperation and exchange good practices. We are sure that merging good practices from the Western Balkans with the most progressive European Union policies will help countries build forward better and generate productive energy for women economic empowerment, spearheading a next-gen gender equality that leaves no one behind. Let me thank you again, RCC, for this opportunity to be here. I'm really thankful for that on behalf of UNDP. And I would like to wish all of us successful and productive this two days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sahakian. You brought forward some data from the region, but also you shared the positive perspective for our future work. And after all, we are working to make the existing situation better. That's why we are all here. And now I would like to invite you all to take a moment and watch a short video, which will introduce the study that we will discuss today. This was indeed a nice introduction to our next session and the presentation of the study. Before I pass the floor to my colleague Nicola Duell, who will, along with her colleagues, present the study, I would like to remind our respective participants of today's webinar to make good use of the chat section. I already see some of you reaching out. And following the presentation of the study, we will have time to address a couple of your questions related to the study itself, but also we will turn to your questions with our respective panelists. Without further ado, now I pass the floor to Nicola. Nicola, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will not take long to present the study now. I will ask my colleague Anja Heimann to start with the presentation, and then Cornelia, and then myself, I will conclude with the policy recommendations. So thank you, Anja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, today, like you said, we're going to present the findings of our study on women empowerment and equality in the West Balkan 6. We will, I'm sharing my screen, aren't I? The agenda today is that I will start presenting the findings of the current situation of women empowerment in the West Balkan 6, and then in the next part, my colleague Cornelia will move on to elaborate on the future prospects of empowerment by taking into account the impact of COVID-19 and mega trends in the labor market. She will then detail our findings of our modeling exercise of the economic benefits of women empowerment, and she'll then present the Women Empowerment Index, which we have specifically constructed for this survey. And then my colleague Nicola will round up this presentation by detailing the state of play and progress in main policy areas implemented in the West Balkan 6 economies. And she'll also conclude with a few policy recommendations. So without further ado, let's start our first findings in the areas of work. What we find is that when we look at the labor market, and in particular female labor force participation, we see that female labor force participation in the West Balkan region still needs to improve. On average, over the last decade, around 77% of men and aged 20 to 64 were in the labor force, so they were looking for a job or either employed. This compares to just 52% of women. There has been some improvement in the female labor force participation in most regions, but male participation growth has outperformed women's. And because of this, there's a persistent and wide participation gender gap of around 24 percentage points, which is double the EU average. If we then break down employment by sector and occupation, we find there is evidence of horizontal segregation in the labor market, by which we mean that there's a concentration of women and men in different types of occupations and sectors. So here in this graph, we can see the influence of gender stereotypes on women's sectoral choices, which have remained unchanged over the past 5 years. As we would expect, economic sectors which are predominantly male fall into the category what we would call industry. So this is sectors like construction, mining, quarrying, electricity and gas, water supply, manufacturing, while female representation is highest in non-market services, which include caring, education, public administration activities, which is these sectors is where we reach near gender parity in terms of employment. And then on the right-hand graph, so we can see that this near gender parity split in these services sectors are reflected on the right-hand side. So over 2014 to 19, the highest female share of total employment were recorded in medium to high skilled professional and clerical occupations in the West Balkan 6, precisely the sort of occupation that falls under these sectors, public administration and trade and services, for example. So this previously mentioned gender segregation in the labor market is one of the reasons behind the gender pay gap. So in female-dominated occupation, there remains a gender pay gap. But even if men and women earn the same in each industry, we would still see some sort of pay gap just because women concentrate in low-pay occupations and industries on average. If we use the mean nominal monthly earnings of people and then compute the percentage difference between men and women, the average pay gap in the West Balkan region remains wide at around 16% in 2014, but there is much variation by occupation. So in skilled manual occupations, we see the widest gender differences in earnings. It is highest in craft and trade occupations, where women earn 27% less than men on average. And this is related to few women working in high-paid industries, as I've illustrated earlier. On the other hand, in high-skilled occupations, the pay gap narrows. It remains to the detriment of women, but you can see that in medium-skilled occupations, such as clerical support workers, women only earn 2% less than men. Moving on to the area of knowledge and education, which is quite an important aspect because knowledge is such a driver for social change, and it can be a tool for women empowerment, which ultimately results in the reduction of gender inequality. And we see that over 2015 to 19, employment of university graduates outcomes have improved for both genders in the economies. It is noteworthy to mention the Republic of North Macedonia, where the gender gap in education is actually negative, which means that female graduates actually showed higher employment rates than their male counterpart. In Serbia, on the other hand, we see that more men than women, female graduates, are in employment, which is in line with the EU. But we see a decreasing trend of narrowing the gender gap, which is very good to see. The chart on the right-hand side demonstrates that more women than men still do not even enter the labor market at any level of education. So the 4 key findings from this chart are that lower educated women stand less of a chance than their male counterpart of entering the labor market. So in a sense, we see that female potential is being wasted. It also makes sense to upskill for both genders because there's a jump in inactivity rates between the lowest and medium education level, which is quite substantial. So on average, around 30 percentage points for each gender. Thirdly, reaching a higher education level actually pays off more for women than men in terms of inactivity rates. So we've seen in 2019 difference in inactivity rates between the medium education level and high education level. For men was 7 percentage points, while for women it was a staggering 19 percentage points. And last point is that in the West Balkan region, we see more low and medium educated women are entering the labor force rather than men, because inactivity rates have been falling and the gender gap has been slowly decreasing in the last 4 to 5 years or so. These high education levels in women do not automatically translate into high and equal share in decision-making positions, however. So the female share in senior and middle management in most of the economies has been relatively low and remains far from equality. So, which means that in addition to the horizontal segregation in the labor market, which I mentioned earlier, there is a vertical segregation as well. Overall, the West Balkan 6 on average remain below the EU average, which is around 33% of women working in middle and senior management positions in 2019. The picture doesn't look much different in politics either, where women account for around 1/3 of members, which is in line with the EU. But taken together, this representation of women in key decision-making bodies and roles are another factor behind the gender pay gap, which so that despite high education levels, women don't actually represent close to 50% of middle and senior management or in any decision-making role at all. So why is that despite the high education levels? And we found that one explanation of this is actually time spent in care, which moves me to my next slide. So the chart here shows the family or caring responsibilities, which are one of the main reasons among women to not even enter the labor market. When we break down employment by status, we find that as in the EU, in the West Balkan 6, women are more likely than men to work as unpaid family members, but also women are nearly 6 times more likely in the West Balkan 6 to work as unpaid family members than in the EU. So overall, we found that caring responsibilities are an important labor market barrier for women due to a combination of gender stereotypes and, for example, lack of affordable care for the elderly and childcare facilities. And this results in all sorts of gender gaps, not necessarily all in the labor market, but outside as well. As my colleague will now deal in the next section, the current COVID-19 pandemic might exacerbate this problem because women face increased caring responsibilities due to lockdown measures, and which might then hinder further improvement in gender equality. And I will now hand over to my colleague Cornelia.
Thank you, Anya. So I'll continue to present the RCC study with a few insights on COVID impact, as Anya was mentioning, automation, and present the results of the economic benefits of implementing gender equality measures and the Women Empowerment Index we have developed. So to assess the impact of COVID, we have looked at the changes in participation, employment, and unemployment rates from the LFS in the first quarter of the year that we had access at that moment. So what have we noticed is that between 2019 and 2020, the employment rates for women have increased. In terms of gender gaps, what we have noticed is that the improvement in the in the second quarters between the 2 years was driven mainly by more loss in male employment than women, with the exception of Serbia. And I would like to highlight that this has to be viewed or considered in the terms of women are more likely than men to have moved from employment to inactivity rather than from employment to unemployment. And this effect varies by occupation. As Anya already mentioned, the gender segregation of employment by occupation, these short-term effects by occupation that we're seeing that high-skilled women are winning, but low-skilled women in low-skilled occupation are losing, could lead to a longer-term impact. But the COVID pandemic is not the only risk to female employment. There are other risks such as automation. Due to gender segregation, what we see is that women are more in occupation, which the literature deems as having high level of automation potential. At the same time, women are well represented in sectors such as healthcare and social assistance, where the automation potential is low. That means that they are losing on one aspect and gaining on the other aspect. That's the reason why we should consider empowering women and stopping gender segregation by sector and occupation. So why should we empower women? Well, we should empower women because there is a positive relationship between female labor participation and GDP capita. And this can be seen in the graph on the right-hand side. And also the data on the right-hand side shows that in some countries, the gender participation increased less than the GDP, while in other countries, gender participation increased more than the GDP. A study from 2017 of the European Institute of Gender Equality shows that there is economic benefits of gender equality in the EU, and we have used those scenarios of labor market participation and the one on the gender gap in this RCC studies. So how did we do it? Was we considered that implementing gender equality measures addition to the current situation can result either to a rapid progress or a slow progress towards the desired outcome. So which are the desired outcome? Well, let's talk about the first one, which is the reduction in gender participation gap. We assume that policies who are increasing female labor participation They do that with the intention to narrow the gender participation gap. So what is the effect on the economy? More women on the labor market means that the labor force in the economy increases, and then we have additional women entering the labor market. And the economy, therefore, has a higher labor capacity, which in turn can produce more output. So in time, we see that the spillover effect of the labor force in the economy leads to higher GDP per capita. On the right-hand side table, you see that the assumptions we have made on the increase of labor participation rate for women. We use these assumptions together with the estimation results from the IGE study to derive the GDP per capita effect at 1 unit change in the labor force participation. So for the Western Balkan 6, we see that on average they can rise their GDP per capita by 1.5% compared to the current situation if they rapidly increase their labor force, meaning 10% on top of what is the current situation. If they are slower in increasing the labor force participation rate, meaning only 5% on top of the current situation, then the increase in the GDP per capita by 2035 is 0.7%. This 0.7% and 1.5% has to be put on top of already the economic growth that it's driven by other factors. So this is just the economic growth driven by increase in female labor participation. Then similarly, we have looked at the one on gender pay gap. So reducing gender pay gap can be done by having specific measures to increase only the female hourly pay. What happens when you choose to implement such a measure? In the economy, on one hand, you increase the labor cost, which increases the labor cost of the businesses. They might decide to pass this on to the consumers. And then, if once you pass this one to the labor cost increase to the consumers, that means that there will be less demand from the consumers. On the other hand, more women will have more income, which means there will be higher disposable income in the economy, which leads to a higher consumption, which leads to an output demand. So what we have is two conflicting effects, which reflect the impact of the reduction in gender pay gap on the GDP, which as you notice, is lower than the one I presented earlier. Nevertheless, this study is all the analysis that we have presented so far shows that there is a substantial improvement in the economic empowerment of women, and this can be achieved in the West Balkan economies. In turn, would lead to improved economic outcomes. So what do we need? We need to measure the improved economic empowerment of women. So we developed a composite indicator for this purpose. The Women Empowerment Index should be viewed as one that blends insight from different labor market indicator measuring the economic empowerment of women. So the Women Empowerment Index is based on the conceptual framework of PwC Women in Work Index, and it follows most of their methodological choices. We just, due to data availability and some other issues, we have changed to indicators compared to the PwC index. So for this index, which is formed out of 4 indicators, we have Albania, who has performed the best out of the 6 economies, and moreover has improved over time. by improving its performance in 3 out of 5 indicators. So they improve the labor force participation, they reduced female unemployment, and they increased the share of female employees in full-time employment. As I was saying, this index can be viewed to look at the progress over time of an economy, but you can also use it to look at your peers and how do you behave better than your peers. What do we see? We see that Albania has improved much over time, but it's just by just improving the performance in 3 indicators out of the 5. But how does it compare to other economies? Well, probably some of you have noticed some high-income economies, such as the Netherlands, who are ranking low in the index. Why is that? Well, it's due to the performance of the Netherlands in these 5 indicators, which has to be compared not only to its performance, but also to Netherlands' performance in relation to the performance of other economies. Also, in the original PwC index, the Netherlands it was ranking in the lower half of the index. So why is Albania doing better than the Netherlands? That's the question. Well, Albania outperforms Netherlands in the share of female employees in full-time employment, but also it outperforms the Netherlands in the share of women in middle and senior management. In fact, Albania is one of the top performers in share of women in middle and senior management, and it's actually outranks most of EU economies, with the exception of Latvia and Sweden. On the other hand, Netherlands is performing better than Albania in, for example, labor participation, but also in the employment gap. In fact, Netherlands has more, just slightly more women in employment than male, but these women, only 25% of these women who are in employment are in full-time employment. It doesn't mean that we have to see this as a negative. This indicator is not necessarily needs to be from a negative perspective. We have to think about what is the motivation behind this low performance in the indicator. And it's not only Netherlands that performs low in this indicator, it's also Germany, Belgium, and Austria, who have fewer women in full-time employment. This low performance can be motivated by a personal choice. There is income enough made from lower than full-time employment, so they don't need to work more, or it's an issue related to the lack of affordable childcare, and therefore that's the reason why they choose to work less than full-time employment. So with this statement, I finish my presentation and I give the floor to my colleague Nicola from economics, who would talk you through the policy recommendation. Nicola?
So thank you very much, Cornelia and Anya, for having given the state of play, and specifically also to Cornelia, who was our project manager from Cambridge Econometrics, for giving an idea of what the economic benefits are and what the challenges are in terms of COVID-19 and technological trends like automation. So what I'm going to present now is a bit of stock taking of policies which have been implemented in the Western Balkan 6. So it's not that they start from zero. On the contrary, improvements have been made. And I give some conclusions, some policy recommendations on how to go forward. So I hope, next slide, please. Yeah, so to start with, I have 7 policy fields or 7 type of measures. So the first one would be to stress really the importance of a comprehensiveness of a policy approach and institutions. So from the policy trend, clearly what we can see is that all Western Balkan economies have made efforts to set up relevant institutions and introduce coordination and gender responsive budgeting mechanisms. Coordination and gender mainstreaming needs to be perceived indeed as a permanent task, as we will see that really improvements will come over time. So it takes time to change the awareness, the structural problems, and to change the mindset also. So it takes time. So the recommendations would be to continue to systematically scrutinize laws, regulation, and the regulations of institutions and of policy measures in terms of their impact on women's access to employment and also the quality to employment. And as already has been said, very important also to career progression. Ensure that the sustainable financing of the measures, we know that Western Balkan economies have introduced measures, often they are financed by international donors, and there is certainly a need for a structural financing and to make sure that the budgets are constructed in a sustainable way. Then, of course, for policy making, regularly monitor the impact and the outcome of the measures, and also regularly monitor the outcomes on the labor market to be sure where still policy gaps are and action needed. So regularly, for example, update the Women Empowerment Index, look into the details of the gender pay gap, and also look into details of employment gaps by sectors and by occupations to be sure to fully grasp the gender segregation of employment and its changes over time. The next slide, please. So the next one would be the legal framework against discrimination. So here the policy trends, we see that the Western Balkan 6 economies have made some progress to improve anti-discrimination legislation, which is very welcome, but the implementation mechanisms have not improved sufficiently. This means that mechanisms need to be in place to support implementation of the law, and women need to be aware about their rights. So that is also part of the implementation. And this is often not the case in the Western Balkan 6. Then there is a need to raise awareness about all forms of gender discrimination and target this awareness raising at the employers, at the chambers of commerce, the social partners, education institutions, legal institutions, and also the labor inspectorates, which are there to make sure that gender discrimination is not happening at the workplace. Then strengthen the institutional capacities to effectively implement the legal framework. And here we have seen in particular a need to develop here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo. Next slide, please. As my colleagues has stressed several times, one of the big barriers to employment of women is the lack of access to affordable and quality childcare and elderly care. So, in fact, if we look at the data, it varies across the economies, but clearly the data in the Western Balkans and the EU and also in the OECD see that there is a clear link between children attending early childcare education, and the employment rates of women. Another important factor, also with regard to the gender roles and gender stereotypes, is the possibilities of fathers to take parental leave. And that has been introduced in some economies, but take up could be higher. So the recommendations would be, of course, to continue to expand access to affordable and quality childcare, monitor the attendance of children of all ages, including pupils, not only at kindergarten ages, expand childcare in rural areas where the access to employment is the most difficult, and monitor also the quality of education. Implement gender-sensitive pedagogical concepts into early childcare education, still also with a view to break gender stereotypes at the long term. Avoid disincentives for employers to employ young women, and improve employment protection for pregnant women. Encourage fathers to take parental leave, and promote the implementation of flexible working time, which would allow parents to better reconcile family and responsibilities and work. Next, please. So another policy area would be lengthening of working lives. So one issue and challenge is that long periods of inactivity of women enhance the risk of poverty. So it is important that women are employed over an important part of their working life. There is an important gender gap in the retirement age, with women retiring at younger ages than men. And also the employment rates of older workers are lower than for prime age workers. So in terms of policy recommendations, the first one would be to narrow the gender gap in retirement age, so by raising the statutory retirement age of women. Implement policies that allow to combine work and pensions. Then going back to the whole life perspective of women, support labor market access after a career break. So make sure that women after a career break, which happens very often when they raise their children, they can come back easily, and also to introduce measures still related also to childcare to reduce undesired extended career breaks, and promote employment of older workers outside the agricultural sector, and further reduce age discrimination, which also is related to awareness raising activities among employers. So we stressed already several times the importance of human capital development, and we have seen that the enrollment of young women in tertiary education has increased substantially, but the middle-aged and older women still have low educational attainments. So here the recommendation would be to increase further the educational level of women, because not all women have equal access to education, and there are minority groups and people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds will still not have, whether specifically girls more than boys do not have access to education. Develop and implement vocational guidance to reduce gender segregation. That means to incentivize women to take up STEM education, and also encourage young boys to go into female-dominated occupation, both at university and wet level. Another policy area would be to implement remedial education and upskilling programs for the middle-aged and older women to increase their employment chances and better quality of employment. and improve the quality of education by revising the curricula and the textbooks, still with the objective to reduce gender segregation and gender stereotypes. So coming to the next slide, please. To the next policy field, promote entrepreneurship. So here as well, Western Balkan 6 economies have implemented entrepreneurship programs for women. So progress has been made here, but these programs are often at a low scale, and the gender gap in entrepreneurship is particularly large. So what we would recommend here is scale up the programs to support entrepreneurship. That would be the first thing to do, and encourage and support women in rural areas to make investments to increase productivity, but also to diversify their supply and supply chains. Provide advisory services not only to women, but also to financial institutions, so that they can improve their credit risk assessment, initiate and coordinate mentorships programs for women, and improve the reporting of gender disaggregated data on entrepreneurship and on property. So turning to the last policy field, which is active labor market program. So what we have seen is that the Western Balkan 6 economies have adequately targeted active labor market programs at women. So the programs are there. Rural women have been identified, mid-aged, older women. So that is all fine. But the programs are generally at a rather low scale. And the budgets remain very low. The public employment services remain understaffed, and in particular, the related social services have poor capacities. So what we recommended here would be in the area of active labor market programs would be to intensify efforts to reach out to inactive women and to informally employed women, with the objective to place women into formal employment. Significantly increase the budgets for upskilling mid-level and low-skilled unemployed adults. Provide upskilling for women returning to the labor market after a career break. Increase regional mobility by providing transportation support to unemployed women if they take up employment. This can happen through vouchers, for example. Implement also a gender dimension in employment strategies for disadvantaged groups, for example, regarding to Roma minority groups and others, and develop and implement dedicated startup programs. So this can be also an area of active labor market policies. And finally, strengthen the capacities of social services at the local level, and continue to improve the cooperation between the social and employment services. So these were the recommendations I had, and we would be very happy to discuss with you or to take up your questions. So you have the chat function, so please use also the chat functions. I've seen that we already have one question, but I really would like to encourage you to pose your question through the chat function. So the one question we have, I will read it, is on behalf of the Kiana Foundation. Sorry if I pronounce it not rightly. There was the question that there are serious structural issues at play with the COVID-19. We have seen that women labor's rights have been even more precarious in position than usual, impacted especially so by poor decision making by the Western Balkan governments. To this extent, extent, the recommendations presented in the report did not reflect the introductory statements at the beginning of this panel, and that they focused more on women's entrepreneurship than the structural barriers impacting women's economic empowerment. That is something that women's CEOs in the region are working on tirelessly. I will come a discussion on how to include the work of women CEOs in your work to address these barriers and improve the structural foundation standing on Western Balkan women entering the labor market. So I think that is a very good question, which I would kind of link to first, and then I give the floor to my colleagues if they want to add something. I think that is exactly the fits to the type of recommendation when we say awareness rising. And the actors for this awareness rising can, of course, be and should be the CEOs in particular, and it would perfectly fit into the recommendations regarding mentorship programs. So I think, thank you for this. I think the comments and the question probably also goes to some policy actors and to the CEOs in the Western Balkans, but I don't know if my colleagues want to add something to this, Cornelia, perhaps.
Yeah, just to add on what you're saying, indeed, it's more on the recommendation side, because these kind of issues, the structural issues at play during the pandemic were not yet available in the statistics when we have looked at it. We, at the moment where we started the data analysis, we only had available for most of the countries in the region, only the first 2 quarters, then came also the third quarter, but it was not yet present in the data, so we could not see it. And in general, structural issues can be seen in a long period of time. That's why we also looked sometimes the period to 2010 to 2019. If the data allowed us, if the data didn't allow us, we looked at a 5-year period, just so that we can capture this kind of structural issues at play. With just looking at 1 year of data, it's impossible to see these. But by looking, you'll see in the RCC study that we have tried to include a more historical data analysis to try to get these issues. But indeed, it cannot be seen, and as Nicola was saying, it's part of the recommendations that she has put forward. Thank you.
So thank you. So yeah, we have put the link of the study in the chat function. So the study is published, and you can access it. And we would be, of course, happy if you access the study. Thank you. Is there any other question?
I believe for the moment, we do not have any questions. We might get some during the panel discussion. So let me now turn our attention to the panel, which will, building on what we heard today, address several pertaining issues quite relevant for women in the Western Balkans. We have today with us inspiring women, experts across a wide array of fields from the Western Balkans, with whom we will discuss a number of important questions. We will need to be strict with timing for each intervention in order to leave enough time for the question and discussion later on. So I would kindly ask our panelists to stick to around 5 minutes of interventions. So let me straight away turn to Dr. Ermira Ciosea. She's a professor at the European University of Tirana. Dr. Ciosea, as part of academia and a researcher who also deals with gender-related issues, in your review, how is it possible to connect university education with the labor market needs so as to work towards reducing the gender gap in the labor market? Do university, in your view, sufficiently attract women to become scientists, to enroll, for instance, in STEM disciplines? And in general, do university curriculum fairly reflect the globalization challenges and advancement in both innovation and technology. Dr. Chosia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Elmira Chosia. I am a professor in business and management at the European University of Tirana, and I'm so glad to be part of this panel, and I would like to thank you for the invitation. Gender issues and women empowerment is very important topic for every society, and especially for Western Balkan countries. And I would like to share with you some ideas and some point of view. My daily work is related to a university environment. It's a job that gives me the opportunity to grow professionally and to have autonomy too. Teaching and research at the university is a career that is invested over time, that requires a lot of passion, and that is rewarded through results, relationships with students, industries, and international colleagues. Satisfaction for the contribution to the education of the young generation and the future of the country. The gender gap at the university level seems at first sight to be narrow. But if we look through the figures, we would point out, for example, that at 12 state university in Albania, only 2 rectors are women. At the university where I work, from 9 senior management level, only 2 of them are women. Also in Albania, there are some ad hoc committees in higher education system with an important decision-making for the academic careers of pedagogues, usually led by men and majority of men. Data and studies show that girls' participation at the university is higher than boys in Albania. Moreover, students girls learn more than students boys. They are very committed, work better in teams, and are class leaders. Career offices at universities work to meet especially business requirements for intern and staff, mainly at entry levels. For this reason, they usually do not meet gender gap problems. Based on my experience today in many job positions, female students are more wanted. Another aspect that I encounter in my work is that a number of female students attending an Erasmus semester is slightly larger than male students. Gender gap problems appear for women graduates at certain stage of their lives and when they seek to climb career ladders. In current knowledge-driven societies, universities are increasingly involved in outreach activities that extend beyond teaching and research. In this regard, universities have started to become more open towards societies, more entrepreneurial universities, performing different kinds of activities, for example, knowledge dissemination, technological innovation, social innovation, advisory services, or entrepreneurship with government support or not. Western Balkan universities are shaping their activities through models of entrepreneurial universities. EU projects are supporting universities in building capacity for new programs, laboratories, innovations, strategy for collaboration with industry spin-offs, etc. But more effort is required, more contribution to GDP for education and improvement of the whole education system. University enrollment policy in Albania is based on merit preference system. Choice of study program by students is oriented by the needs of the local and international market. There is a tendency to study more IT, more business informatics, medicine, and nursing. And female students are studying more in these programs. Regarding the policies of universities to have more female students in STEAM, there is still no policy in Albania because the system is going in direction of the market needs. That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I will go further and would like to ask Mrs. Leila Gajanika, I hope that's correct, who is a legal expert and researcher and is currently working as a legal advisor in Bosnia. She authored many published research papers in the area of human rights, anti-discrimination standards, and with the emphasis on gender equality. She is author of the first in-depth study on gender-based labor discrimination in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I would therefore like to ask you, where do you see the main challenges in reducing unequal treatment for women to access the labor market and for career progression in Bosnia and Herzegovina? But I get the question is relevant also for the other Western Balkan economies. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to bring some Bosnia and Herzegovina experiences, and I will try to be as brief as possible, even this is a quite complex issue and question. The position of women in the labor market is unequal, actually, in almost all categories of jobs, age groups, professional qualifications in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The employment rate of women in our country is twice lower comparing to men, while the percentage of women who do unpaid, so-called domestic work is many times higher compared to men. Violations of labor rights affect women differently and definitely more often, precisely because they are women, or women with different abilities, or LBT women, or women over 45 years old, or pregnant women. Gender-based discrimination is almost normalized in our labor market. Still, many forms of gender-based discrimination often remain silenced due to stigma, shame, or fear. This stands in particular for sexual harassment at work. Women are exposed to quid pro quo situations, proposal of a sexual nature, assaults, and all of this in an environment where they should be safe. What is often overlooked, primarily repressed by the question of the very existence, is how giving up education and professions affects women. According to the structure of the unemployed by the highest achieved educational level in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this percentage is more than twice as high for women with higher education. The result of the research that was already mentioned in the chat, conducted in 2019 in all Western Balkan countries, and then in 2020 published for the whole region, named Gender-Based Discrimination and Labor in the Western Balkan, showed that awareness of the gender-based discrimination at work is extremely low, and this applies both to employees and employers. This is reflected in a very small number of reported and prosecuted cases of gender-based discrimination related to labor. Legal framework is also an issue here. Legal fragmentation, as you already mentioned in your recommendation, especially for Bosnia and Herzegovina, contributes to confusion with different standards of protection, procedures, and sanctions applicable under various overlapping laws. Implementation of the existing legal framework remains a key challenge for all Western Balkan countries. Another emerging issue is definitely pandemic. The COVID-19 exposed and actually sharpened current class and gender differences in our countries. Women are hit harder by the economic impact caused by the COVID-19, and they are also experiencing an increased burden in unpaid household and care work. Challenges women face in the labor market, very specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina, left them exposed to the social exclusion in the post-crisis period, as government measures after the so-called first wave of pandemic for economic recovery were often made without taking the needs of women into account. Therefore, I would say the main challenges are definitely unequal position on labor market, as well as unequal access to employment and labor, but also gender-based discrimination in the workplace, which includes promotion, gender pay gap, sexual harassment in the workplace, dismissal due to pregnancy, and denial of the maternity rights. The causes of this inequality are deeply rooted in gender roles, patriarchy, lacking knowledge of rights, but also, and I would like to put quite emphasis on this, distrust in institutions, in protection mechanisms, lacking implementation of legislation, and very importantly, a very difficult economic situation in which every job is a good job regardless of inequality, violence, and stagnation that women suffer. The consequences of this are poorer, less democratic, and societies with slow progress. The consequence we have yet to face is feminization of poverty, but also the pension gap as a result of a long-term inequality in the labor market. The solution, therefore, should be sought in a comprehensive social, legal, and economic market level, addressing the problem of the equal participation of women in need-based and definitely inclusive way. I would stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gachanica. Most certainly the points that you just raised can be shared with women across the region, and even more so, it is important to emphasize them all the time. Let me now turn to Ms. Iliriana Yakagashi. She is an executive director of Kosovo Women for Women, where she manages programs that have served more than 38,000 women since 1999. Mrs. Gashi, having a vast experience in the non-governmental sphere, could you share with us a practical view of what are priority areas of greatest concern for women economic empowerment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? The study has shown that the rates of women participation have decreased as a direct consequence of the pandemic. So how do you see this impacting women in Kosovo, and in particular women from disadvantaged groups?
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this great distinguished group, and thank you for the study. It really is a synthesized piece that shows really a lot of data that we need. And I am pleased to say that our organization, in fact, already tackles a lot of recommendations that have been given. Your study shows already how low is Kosovo in all the data that you have shown, unfortunately. So the need for concern is even bigger when the starting point is so low. So I will just maybe reiterate that the number of women that are active at the labor market is just a bit above 28%, it's 22%. So 78% of women are inactive, are not looking for a job. So the number of women working is very, very low. And unfortunately, the pandemic has highlighted the unpaid care and house care that really stops women from being economically empowered and active. So the number of jobs that have been lost, although it's very difficult, as somebody said, it's very difficult to get real data already. I mean, it's very early and the pandemic is not over yet, and one wave after another makes it more difficult. Unfortunately, in Kosovo, we also had elections in the beginning of the year, so most of the surveys are directed into women in the decision making, but not in the labor market. So the data, but what the data shows is that the number of women that are looking for jobs is increasing. So it shows that how many jobs were lost. What I am concerned more is on two levels. It's women that work in informal sector that have lost their jobs for sure, and that is going to be even more difficult to improve. because they are usually employed by families, usually taking care of children. In your survey, it was already mentioned that the care of children is very poor. So they take care of children, and being that the women who employ them has lost their jobs, so it will be even more impoverished because there will be two women at one case losing the job. The one that was job giver and the one that was job taker. So we are yet to really feel the consequences, and we are yet to measure what really is going to happen, unfortunately. And the second are the owners of businesses. Let me just mention that we, for 20 years, as you have just said, we have worked with women with no education, the poorest of the poor. We were part of Women for Women International country office, and we have graduated to their affiliate. So now we have continued to also support our previous graduates. Some of them have become entrepreneurs. So we continue to work also with women entrepreneurs. Maybe 99% of the enterprises or the businesses of women are micro, are 1 or 2 people. So although we still don't have the data on how many businesses were closed, we are sure that there will be a lot of them being closed, including that the economic power is going to get smaller, so there will be more consequences, as I said. It was good that there was a gender-based intervention. So thanks to our women decision makers, there was a request that the package of the recovery includes a special amount for women's businesses. So the Agency of Gender Equality has had 2 million euros. One was directly dispersed to women preschool care institutions, private ones, because there was a huge risk that they will close. And the second one is going to be dispersed through CSOs. The Quina till Quina question maybe is linked to this. So in the next 6 months, we will be implementing that. And when we come to the minorities, especially the Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian, unfortunately, there is a double discrimination for women from those communities. It is because they are women and because they are from the minority that is not really getting to have positive discrimination as other minorities. So it is interesting because I was just reading a book that in Finland and I'm sure in other developed countries there are no segregated neighborhoods for those minorities. So sometimes I think we start by excluding them when we give them, a special place to live. They live together, but then the inclusion is more difficult. So I think that we will need some policies on positive discrimination. As an organization, we do work with them. There are educated women, but unfortunately, although they get a high education, 95% of them are unemployed, no matter that they have a high education. So, and then we need to have some positive discrimination policies. There were some initiatives that have started in public institutions. It is good that we have CSOs that deal with the minorities. I am a board member of the organization that is a network of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian organizations of women. But there is need to include them more because it's almost same as with the neighborhood. So Romashkali Egyptian organizations deal with those women. In fact, we need to integrate, to work together more, not to have kind of a division of Albanian, Serbian, other minority organizations that deal each with its own community. I'll stop there. Maybe there will be more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an important insight. I would like to give the floor to Sanja Popovic-Pantic. She's chairwoman of the Enterprise Europe Network Sector Group on Women Entrepreneurship. So we heard a lot about entrepreneurship gaps this morning, and it was just addressed again, the importance. So it would be very interesting for you to know what would needed to promote the women, that women have access to finance and guidance to set up a business in Montenegro. Please, Mrs. Popovic-Pantic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, before answering your question, just to mention that sector group of women entrepreneurship within Enterprise Europe Network is 21 member group from 16 EU countries, European countries, not only EU, but the group of member from the Balkan is the biggest one, and we have 4 members from 4 Balkan countries, Western Balkan countries, plus Croatia, which means that we have 5 members from this region, from Albania, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Croatia. As to Montenegro, we are welcoming, of course, the application that is underway, and the member will join us soon. So that we could even more foster the cooperation in the Balkan region among us, which is really remarkable in last 5 years, based on the services provided within the standardized set of services by Enterprise Europe Network. So we used to have many B2B meetings between us here in the Balkan, many webinars, conferences, and our colleagues are very, very active really in connecting women entrepreneurship stakeholders, meaning women's business associations, but also the female clients of Enterprise Europe Network, meaning female companies. As to Montenegro, your question is very much targeted to this country. I am happy that I received some important data from our colleague from Enterprise Europe Network Montenegro, from Ivana Tomašević, who provided me with some important overview regarding the national schemes. But apart from the national schemes to support financially female businesses, there are also some international schemes like the EBRD schemes, which is for years very much committed to support women's businesses through financial support, favorable credit lines. And at the moment, this scheme is active also in Montenegro through NLB Bank. Also, there are some other schemes like Investment Development Fund of Montenegro, which provides special credit lines for women entrepreneurs with grace period of 2 years, and in some municipalities the interest rate is 0, which is really very favorable. Also, other municipalities in Montenegro are providing some grant schemes up to 5,000 euro. As you can see from this, the limits or this amount of money, this is small scale schemes to support mostly micro businesses, which of course prevailed in the structure of the female businesses everywhere, not only in our region. But on the other side, we have a very interesting data that the participation of women entrepreneurs in innovation funding is pretty much low, even at the EU level. So you can imagine how low is it at the regional level here, this region in the Balkan, in the Western Balkans specifically, and I would invite the stakeholders to think of designing the scheme which would support specifically innovative female companies which have capacity to internationalize their businesses. So some schemes like vouchers for innovation or vouchers for digitalization, especially because we all are witnessing that this COVID crisis brought some new challenges and the new and of course new chances for women enterprises to grow up, which lay of course in this digitalization and digital transformation. So not only digitalization, but digital transformation, meaning that current functions, business functions like sales, like marketing, like many other functions in business functions should be digitalized. And this is expensive, of course. Not all of them are expensive, but the core business functions switching to digitalization is expensive, and this is something which should be supported, even of course in Montenegro, where the percentage of the SMEs in total number female SMEs is 23%, while entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs makes 32% of registered entrepreneurs. So this is something which I would, of course, point out. And the important thing to say for Montenegrin female companies is that there is the strategy of women entrepreneurship to be adopted in upcoming period, so very soon. And this strategy highlights the importance of access to finance in the first place, then promotion and networking, improving knowledge and skills, improving business environment. So all these columns are in this strategy, and access to finance, of course, is the most important, and not only for Montenegro, but for other Balkan countries. The main weakness for women in businesses, female entrepreneurship, is the lack of collaterals when asking for the credits, when applying for the credits. So the guarantee scheme to be established is one of the main recommendations for Montenegro, but also for other countries in Western Balkan, as women are discriminated at the very beginning when they want to start up, for example, their businesses. They do not have enough collateral to provide to the banks, even if there are credit lines for the startups. Also, it stands for the well-established businesses, not only startups companies. They very often do not have a collateral, which is higher for of course bigger amount of money. And this is something that would I would say as a message to the stakeholders. Is that 5 minutes?
Yes, sure. Thank you for really.
We can discuss even more, of course, about regional problems, but
there is so much.
I would like
to say.
to keep to the timing.
And thank you very much, Ms. Popovic-Pantic, for sharing actually the regional perspective with an example of Montenegro. Enterprise Europe Network is impressive, and we hope you will continue with the same pace to create more enabling environment for our business entrepreneurs in the region. Let me now turn to a private sector perspective where we will continue discussing entrepreneurship, but also a bit beyond that. We will hear from Ms. Tatiana Shteriova, who serves as a Secretary General of the Western Balkan 6 Chamber Investment Forum. Ms. Shteriova, undoubtedly, women entrepreneurship is one of the hardest hit sectors in the pandemic, but it is also the one that has the great potential for women to thrive and to narrow the gender equality or inequality gap. And in your view, what or how could the Chamber Investment Forum at the economy and at the regional level help to connect women and ensure the environment that is proper for them, as well as seize the opportunities that women can have today?
Thank you very much, Bojana. It is a pleasure to be here today in the presence, although only virtual, of such exceptional leaders of women empowerment, and I kindly thank you for the very valuable recommendations from the study that was conducted and presented to us today. It would not be exaggerating if we concluded that 2020 was amongst the most difficult years faced for all of us, not only in economic terms, but also in day-to-day living. This especially relates to women in the private sector, with all the restrictions that have been implemented or introduced in the last year on different levels. And with the transition to working from home, schooling from home, and basically doing almost everything from home, it has been really hard to maintain regular operations. So it would be safe to say that the pandemic has really heightened a number of already pre-existing obstacles to women entrepreneurship, especially when it comes to two important issues. One is the work-life balance, and the second was access to finance, which topics which were already tackled upon in the discussions of the previous panelists during today's event. So this on one hand reflects on the pre-pandemic situation we had even before all these current circumstances we are facing today. Most of the women-led businesses are SMEs, which means that even in normal surroundings, without the pandemic disrupting daily activities, the SMEs by themselves have much more unfavorable starting position. They have limited resources. They have much more limited possibilities to get access to finance. They do not have so developed managerial capacities. And what is maybe crucial is that they have the low margins to absorb the impacts of unforeseen circumstances. All these weaknesses are even more emphasized when it comes to women entrepreneurs. This situation brings about the need to enhance talks about cooperation on all possible levels and in all possible forms. And in this occasion, I would like to draw on the experiences of my own organization, that is the Chamber Investment Forum. It was created as an association of the 6 national chambers of commerce from the Western Balkans region, with the focus of economic aspects of the regional economic integration processes. And in the same core of its existence, it brings to light a very positive idea, and that is that jointly we can do much more than in terms of economic development than we could ever do each one of us in our own. Especially this is positive or is implemented when it comes to overcoming the barriers for economic growth. Now, we propose that the similar approach should be transposed to the issue of supporting the swift recovery of women entrepreneurship in the post-pandemic period and securing the possibilities for them to come out of this process as stronger, as more competitive and more productive as possible. The crisis, we all are aware, had a transformative impact of many women entrepreneurship business practices and models. Many have introduced digital sales and service promotion in response to the introduced restrictive measures. They have been obliged to change or modify their business models, and maybe some of the changes introduced in the last couple of months even will have long-lasting long-lasting impacts on the mere vision of where the company will be heading, or in which manners it will continue to develop in the next years. So the support that on regional level should and will be provided to them goes in two directions. On one hand, we should provide any possible support for digitalization of their operations, provide them custom-made trainings for enhancing the digital skills for women entrepreneurs. And on the other hand, we should encourage and enable the exchange of views, experiences, and all the positive impacts for overcoming the challenges and provide them being shared amongst women entrepreneurs, thus enabling all possible manners or models for their interlinking. Many of the chambers of commerce within the region that are part of the Chamber Investment Forum on daily basis enact diverse activities for both of these focus points. And I would like to conclude or wrap up by pointing out that only with joint forces we can come out of the crisis even stronger. I thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So thank you very much. We would finally ask our last panelist, Mrs. Zorana Dimitrijevic, who is working at the coordination body for gender equality of the Republic of Serbia. And as a representative of this coordination body, could you share with us your insights into what government in Serbia is doing to create the right environment for achieving increased participation of women in the labor market? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Nicola, for the question and for the introduction. And hello to everyone, to all the participants and panelists here. It is a great honor for me to be here today. And on behalf of the Coordination Body for Gender Equality, I would just like to thank you for the invitation. And I would like to stress that regional meetings like this one are very useful for all of us, because I think that women's economic empowerment in the Western Balkans is an extremely important issue for the entire region. So it's important that we share experiences and that we learn from each other as we are doing today, because it is very beneficial for all of us. Let me start by saying that once again, that the coronavirus pandemic really intensified many problems that women in Serbia, and not just in Serbia, but also worldwide and in the region have already been facing. And gender inequalities in the labor market is definitely one of the main problems that women here are experiencing. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, many women have experienced frequent layoffs from work. The burden of unpaid care and domestic work increased, as we already heard from previous panelists, which left women in a very vulnerable and disadvantaged position. And just to give you some context for further discussion, the employment rate for women in Serbia is about 42%, compared to about 57% for men. 64% of all informal or wage workers in Serbia are women, which again is very problematic in a way that they are in a very vulnerable position, because employed like this, they are not entitled to any kind of social, medical, legal protection, which means that they are not even protected against any kind of any type of violence, even at work. On top of that, the gender pay gap is another problem, as we heard from previous panelists. So is the unemployment rate among women above the age of 55. Now, to get back to your question, Nicola, some of the measures that Serbia has taken to tackle this issue include an improved normative and strategic framework in the field of gender equality. And I think this is particularly important to stress, because this year we are about to adopt 3 major laws in the field of gender equality and anti-discrimination. And the most important law being, of course, the gender equality law, which will for the first time legally recognize and define unpaid care and domestic work. Which of course is an extremely important issue. And speaking of unpaid work, I think it's important to say that Serbia was the second country ever to conduct the economic analysis of unpaid work, which showed that on average, women spend about 20% of their time or more working on unpaid domestic and care work compared to their male counterparts. And there is an estimate that the unpaid work that women do in their households amounts to about 546 euros per month, which again amounts to about 15% of our domestic GDP, which I'm sure you would agree is very worrying. Apart from these normative and strategic legal framework that Serbia is currently on the way to adopt, I think it's important to mention also the establishment of these institutional mechanisms for gender equality at all levels, and also the economic empowerment of women and increased participation of women in the labor market, both on the national but as well on the local level, is one of the most important areas of our work in this field. Just to mention a couple of projects that we've been working on in this field, which are very important for the topic of participation of women in the labor market. The first one being the project which works on increasing the participation of women and inclusion of women entrepreneurs and owners of small businesses in the value chain of large enterprises in order to ensure that their self-employment is sustainable. Another project which is important to mention works on supporting women from rural areas of Serbia who produce different types of traditional handicrafts. And this project works on encouraging companies, public enterprises, institutions, international organizations, as well as individuals to purchase and buy goods and products from these women, thereby supporting their enterprises. Sorry. And by 2020, about 766 women from rural areas of Serbia have received some type of economic support through this project and through these initiatives. And let me just add that the largest project in this area that we've been working on is funded by the European Commission under the Instrument for Pre-Accession 2, IPA 2. The project is entitled Support to Priority Actions for Gender Equality. And Coordination Body for Gender Equality, together with UN Women, are the main partners on this project. And we have supported about 20 local self-governments that organized various types of educative workshops and seminars for women in the field of entrepreneurship. They helped them develop their own business plans. They taught them how to increase the sales rates of their products, how to grow their businesses, and different types of skills and tools which are necessary to increase their the chances of them being employed later. Also, it taught them how to again grow their businesses and ideally how to employ other women. And over the past 3 years, more than 3,600 women were supported and economically empowered to participate in the labor market as a result of this particular project. And let me just conclude by saying that I think that increased participation of women in the labor market across the region is important, and not only just for the obvious economic reasons that we already discussed and heard about, such as increasing the domestic GDP, but perhaps I would say even more importantly, because their participation in the labor market would help eliminate harmful and discriminatory social and gender norms. It would help empower women to make their own independent choices. And I strongly believe that we need effective and comprehensive, sustainable measures to address gender inequalities in the labor market. And taking these steps would probably be one of the most important steps towards women's economic empowerment, the prevention and elimination of gender-based violence, and ultimately towards a gender equal society and the entire region. Thank you once again for having me.
So thank you very much for these insights. And perhaps one follow-up question related to one question I got from Professor Emira Kosia about the possibilities and the challenges of upskilling and reskilling women in COVID-19 pandemic. So you just said you had also entrepreneurship training for these women. So one general question would be the experiences you have to implement this kind of activities under COVID-19 pandemic. So my question would be, do you use online tools? Is there anything like this? So that would, I don't know who of you would like to take up this question and share your experience. Yes, please. Iliana.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I will answer this. We were working with 50 businesses, women's businesses, owned and co-owned by women, financed by GIZ during 2018, 19, and 20. So the pandemic found us in a phase where we were delivering trainings. It was a good time that we had already identified the trainers or the experts who would deliver trainings, and it was organized. The trainings were after 1 month, when we saw that in fact it is not going to be 2 weeks and it's over. We organized all the trainings online. It was very useful. It was interesting because it was useful on many levels. The owners of the businesses were home. So although the burden was big, of course, the household choirs and homeschooling and everything else, still they said it was refreshing for them when the businesses were closed to hold the training from home. So it was very good, but we have also other programs that are for, as I mentioned, uneducated women. So with them, we used Viber, because most of them do have phones. So we organized groups, but that was not economic empowerment, that was more on the social empowerment. But we also switched our trainings from the life skills to how to protect themselves from the virus. What are the measures? So they were sometimes drawing the measures and exchanging photos between them. So yes, we have moved into online.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting, indeed. Yes.
Okay, now I see that we have another question from Ms. Hagel. It's sector specific, but it addresses the concerns that we already raised throughout the webinar today. It is about the data collection, and she's from the transport community, and she would like to know whether from your knowledge, you have any data on the percentage of women employed in the transport sector in the Western Balkans, either in your respective economies or at the regional levels, and this is very male-dominated sector. This is a sector that we have not touched upon in our study, but maybe you do know from your respective economies examples where the data collection is actually being conducted specifically for this sector. Would any of you have any idea? Okay, I see no raised hands. It means that this remains a problem that we will need to tackle as we go on, precisely with the data collection in various sectors across the Western Balkans. Okay, thank you very much. As now we are a bit ahead of our time, and I would like to make sure that we finish on time. I would like to thank to all of the panelists and would like to invite Ms. Tanya Miščević, our Deputy Secretary General of RCC, to try to sum up this very fruitful discussion today. So I would give her the floor for concluding remarks.
Exactly. Thank you very much. First of all, to all of you participating, presenting the study, Nicole and dear friends. And also grateful for this very good discussion and tour de table around the region regarding the empowerment of women. It helps a lot to understand and live and try to upgrade the position. Of course, it will be extremely difficult to conclude, which I could not do it without the help of both Boyana and Evisi, dear friends from the RCC. And I should start again by thanking for the insightful contribution, the consultant of Cambridge Economics and Economics for the presentation, and of course for the comprehensive work. I'm sure that we are going to read it even more, more carefully than we could even to discuss today. It is on the website, if I'm not wrong, of the RCC, so you can see it. And also the link has been shared at the chat box during this discussion. I truly believe that we had a very substantial discussion, and we further paved the way for regional joint efforts in promoting gender equality and empowering women by recognizing the current situation and recommending concrete activities and, of course, actions. Several of highlights that I would like specifically to reiterate from today's webinar. Despite recent progress in a number of key indicators regarding gender equality in the Western Balkan 6 economies, gender gaps remain large, in particular, as we discuss, in participation and employment rates, but also in pay. Female share in mid to senior management and entrepreneurial position also still remain low. We discuss a lot about the pandemics, which intensify existing gender inequalities by hitting women the hardest in several aspects: job losses, reduction of paid working hours, increased and unpaid care work, etc. But it also put at risk those recent improvements in gender equality in the labor market, since women are disproportionately represented in the industry that are hit the most. COVID is not the only major risk to the gender inequality. The automation of job risk, displacing many workers too, especially those in low-skilled jobs. Women in the Western Balkan cities have a high share of employment in industry that face an automation potentials. The removal of gender inequality in the labor market has shown to boost the economic growth and generate long-term benefits. The study that we discuss of today suggested that Western Balkan 6 economies could raise their GDP per capita 1.5% by 2035 if Western Balkan 6 undertake rapid action to reduce the gender gap in participation rates, to some extent comparable to improvements in EU envisaged by 2030. The study presents a Women Empowerment Index for the Western Balkan 6, which is a good tool that will allow us to measure and track progress of economic empowerment. This index identifies progress in the Western Balkan 6 economies during 2017 to 2019. For successful outcomes in empowering women, we need to continue coordination between stakeholders and reflect and incorporate gender mainstreaming, still a strange word in our languages, in our respective fields of work. It is clear that all Western Balkan 6 economies have made effort to set up relevant institutions and introduce gender-responsive budgeting mechanisms. again, it is important to continue on this path and to effectively implement the relevant strategies by enhancing coordination between relevant institutions. The gender gap in entrepreneurship remains large, which is why dedicated action is needed in support of women empowerment. And we are very happy that in that respect, we are cooperating very close with the Chamber Investment Forum and congratulating Tatiana for upholding the new position of the Secretary General of the KIF. Women empowerment is important. This study and today's webinar are a continuation of the journey in advocating for gender equality and women economic empowerment. It is worth emphasizing again that it is closely embedded in the Common Regional Market Action Plan endorsed in Sofia last November, actually. We are at the beginning of the journey in implementing these initiatives and actions, and we are happy to already have your collaboration and contribution through this journey. The initiative have jointly started with the UNDP, grateful for all of them for their help, support, and understanding. And it provides a good platform for us to further develop our partnership in this area, as well as the common regional market, which enables us to develop networks. And I am sure that we will continue this joint efforts together. Again, thank you very much for the participation and discussion in today's webinar. Your inputs, your suggestions, added value is actually presented added value to our next steps. And see you at the future events. Stay safe, stay healthy. Looking forward to the successful continuation of our joint efforts. Thank you very much for your attention. Bojana, back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Miščević, for perfectly summing up today's discussion. I will also finish by especially thanking our respective panelists, but also participants who have been with us today. It's been a real pleasure to moderate this event together with Nicola. And I wish us all success. Stay interested, stay connected with each other, but also with us, and support the gender agenda in every possible way. Thank you very much and goodbye.